Is the New York Times running interference for Joe Biden? Sort of like asking if the Pope is Catholic, but today it reached a new low with its attempts to cover for the former vice president. Today it published an article entitled Examining Tara Reade's Sexual Assault Allegation Against Joe Biden. And the article, as such, written by Lisa Lehrer, and Sydney Ember, goes through Tara Reade's accusation, namely that in 1993, she accused Mr. Biden of assaulting her. She says she told others about it. Those people have confirmed it. And just goes down in a very dry, reporterly way, discussing what happened. You know, at times, for example, saying things like, on Thursday, Ms. Reade filed a report with the Washington, D.C. police saying she was the victim of a sexual assault in 1993. The public incident report does not mention Mr. Biden by name, but she said the complaint was about him. So mostly very dry, although there's the occasional hint of menace. You see things like, filing a false police report may be punishable by fine or imprisonment. It's not even used in any way to editorially suggest that she's telling the truth. Rather, it's almost an implicit threat of menace that what she's doing is false. But the article itself isn't almost the story so much as the New York Times attempts to stealth edit a portion of that article and a portion of their tweets on the subject. For example, they did a rather detailed thread talking about this allegation on Twitter, but they actually deleted a tweet. As they said, we deleted a tweet in this thread that had some imprecise language that has been changed in the story. What was the imprecise language, you might ask? Well, you can go ahead and look here. And it says, this is the tweet they deleted, quote, no other allegation about sexual assault surfaced in the course of our reporting, nor did any former Biden staff corroborate Reade's allegation. We found no pattern of sexual misconduct by Biden beyond hugs, kisses, and touching that women previously said made them uncomfortable. Well, not to put too fine a point on it, but, you know, offensive touchings is literally the definition of battery under the law, right? In black-lettered tort law, a battery is a harmful or offensive touching. So hugs, kisses, and touching that women said made them uncomfortable would be the very definition of battery. And since there are hugs and kisses, that would be the definition of sexual battery, which would be the definition of sexual misconduct. So basically, what the New York Times is saying is that they found no pattern of sexual misconduct except for the pattern of sexual misconduct that they found. Pretty embarrassing, kind of not surprising. So then we go back and say, you know, no wonder they deleted it. Given also, think about how bad form this deletion is. Normally, if you're trying to be honest and transparent about your deletion tweets, you include a screenshot of the tweet you deleted so people can evaluate your claim that there was just imprecise language. As somebody pointed out, I forget exactly who. The problem was not that the language is imprecise, it's that it was altogether too precise. And you might wonder why exactly they're running interference for Joe Biden. You could argue that it's because today they're publishing, look at this profile picture, a gorgeous profile picture accompanying Joe Biden's opinion piece about how to safely reopen America. But there's probably something more going on than just the fact that there's a Joe Biden op-ed in the New York Times. Is privilege at work here? And why exactly can Joe Biden get away with things and no conservative can? We'll analyze that shortly. But first, we just started a YouTube channel here at Human Events. Please, if you are a fan of ours, if you follow me on Will Chamberlain or Ian Chung on Twitter, please hit the subscribe button here. It really does a huge amount of good and helps us a lot in terms of getting the message out and getting more traction for the videos we do, which gives us reason to do more and more content for you. But back to the question. Remember again that what is this pattern of sexual assault that Joe Biden's been accused of? Well, Richard Armand Mills, Ram Rants on Twitter, has a remarkable thread all the way back in November 2017 going through the fact that Joe Biden is an open sexual predator. Here you have a video of him kind of fondling, as you can see, a little girl in the chest area. He does a good job of kind of highlighting, ooh, that's really uncomfortable. She's uncomfortable. Here's him smelling a young woman's hair. That's Chris Coons' daughter, by the way, the senator of Delaware. I can't imagine he's a fan. Chris Coons was a fan of that. Here's his hands on a little girl and reaching down. Oh, that's gross. This is terrifying. Here's a clip of he's swearing in Senator Risch. During the photographs, he touches Risch's daughter, specifically asking to take a photo alone with her. And it's just very consistent that he's just extremely inappropriate. Here's another one of him sniffing the hair of a young girl. It's shocking. So I don't know what wouldn't be called a pattern of sexual misconduct, but this seems pretty clearly to be the case. And yet you have this very dry reporting. You have them covering up this pattern of sexual misconduct. And now, again, see, here's the initial report. It says the Times found no pattern of sexual misconduct by Biden. That's a stealth edit it used to contained the same caveat that was in the tweet. As you can see here, the idea beyond hugs, kisses, and touching that women previously said made them uncomfortable. It's really not how Brett Kavanaugh. Remember, the New York Times did a lot of writing about Brett Kavanaugh and the allegations against him back in 2018. It wasn't so dry, wasn't so reporterly. For Christine Blasey Ford, a drastic turn from a quiet life in academia by five reporters at the New Times. The text message from Christine Blasey Ford this summer worried her college best friend, Catherine Pivowarski. I don't know how she wants to pronounce her name. Over their years of friendship as roommates, bridesmaids, and parents on opposite coasts, Dr. Blasey wanted to know, had she ever confided that she'd been sexually assaulted in high school? No, Miss Pivowarski, she texted back. She would have remembered that, and was everything okay? It's like stuff like this sort of dramatic retelling that ultimately protects her is really interesting because it's clearly, like, you go back to the Tara Reade story, she told people at the time, and Miss Ford never even did that. And that's not to, mention how they treated, like, how the New York Times treated people who were, like, interrogating them. For example, here's this article from Mazie Hirona. I believe her. Mazie Hirona takes an aggressive stance in the Kavanaugh hearings, reported by Sydney Ember, same person casting skepticism on Tara Reade. Talking about how she made national headlines with her blunt comments about the treatment of women. She urged men to shut up and step up. And, just a total softball interview. You've been so busy. Everywhere I look, there's another article about you or you're on TV. This is not the only time you've been vocal about the treatment of women. I'm wondering what motivated you to take such a prominent position on the issue of sexual abuse and harassment. Why not give maybe Tara Reade a question and answer period in the New York Times? They wouldn't do that, obviously. Another really obvious glaring evidence of double standard. Here's Brett Kavanaugh fit in with the privilege kid. She did not. Deborah Ramirez that's the second Kavanaugh accuser. Yale experience says much about the college's efforts to diversify its student body in the 1980s. This is by Robin Pogrebin and Kate Kelly, two people who actually wrote a book about Kavanaugh. Far worse than Molly Hemingway and Carrie Severino's book, Justice on Trial, which you should certainly check out. This is recent. This is September 2019. This is only about 6 months ago. And if you guys forgot, this had a hell of a editor's note. Quote, editor's note, September 15, 2009. An earlier version of this article, which was adapted from a forthcoming book, did not include one element of the book's account regarding an assertion by a Yale classmate that friends of Brett Kavanaugh pushed his penis into the hand of a female student at a drunken dorm party. Big, drum roll, please. The book reports that the female student declined to be interviewed, and friends say that she does not recall the incident. That information has been added to the article. So they basically had someone accuse her. I think it was Max Steyer or somebody say, this woman was abused by Brett Kavanaugh. She told me at the time. And then they have, the woman refuses to be interviewed, and her friends say it didn't happen, and she never told them about it. And they didn't include that in the article. Man, the New York Times. But there's also something more here. Like, why does the New York Times get away with stuff like this? Well, let's look at a Politico discussion of this editor's note, right? This catastrophe of journalism that happened at the New York Times back in September 2019. Quote, Trump revs up his attacks after the New York Times adds editor's note to Kavanaugh article. President Trump seized upon an editor's note. Conservatives pounce and seize. That's the real story. It's not the fact that the New York Times engaged in this absolute barbarism, this, what is the right word to describe what they did? This appalling and contemptible failure of journalism. No, the story is the fact that a conservative reacted to it and pointed out how negative it was. Let's talk about what's going on here. What's really happening? Because this isn't just Joe Biden's publishing an op-ed, right? It's not all that's going on here. There's something else. We hear a lot about privilege, and white privilege in particular. And I'm not the kind of person who thinks that privilege doesn't exist. I think there are clearly things in our society where if you have certain attributes, you get certain benefits that other people do not gather. But that's a broad statement about the way society works generally. People are not always treated equally, and that's across the board. But one way in which privilege also functions is that conservatives and liberals are not treated equally, especially by the media, and that itself is a form of privilege, right? Like, what is the definition of privilege? So what is the definition of privilege? As Merriam-Webster says, it's a right or immunity granted as a peculiar benefit, advantage, or favor, right? And it seems like progressives are getting a pretty big benefit of the doubt here. They're almost like Joe Biden doesn't get treated the way that Brett Kavanaugh does. I wonder why. What could be going on here? We actually wrote an article about this. It's titled Carlos Maza's Reign of Terror. And it's a piece I wrote back in June 2019. If you remember all the way back about 10 months ago, Carlos Maza was leading a giant campaign to get Steven Crowder deplatformed from YouTube. And by the same time, he was also advocating that British politicians right-wing politicians rather, get milkshakes thrown at them. So on the one hand, he was advocating political violence. On the other hand, he was demanding that Steven Crowder get deplatformed for using what he considered to be homophobic language against him. And, I'm not here to, the merits of Maza's argument aside, it's remarkable that he could just turn around and do both of these things and not spot the cognitive dissonance and have no one else spot the cognitive dissonance. And it indicates something that's actually going on in terms of a privilege dynamic between conservatives and liberals. And I explained it here. And I'll quote myself. It's kind of weird, but whatever, I'm doing it. This phenomenon may seem novel. A journalist is, on the one hand, calling for the assault and battery of conservatives, milkshaking, and on the other, demanding that a conservative commentator be unpersoned for being mean to him. It isn't. In societies throughout history, the following dynamic is common. Aristocrats may be rude to other aristocrats. Aristocrats can be rude to peasants, but peasants cannot be rude to aristocrats. It might be weird to say, well, Brett Kavanaugh's a peasant, but in the construct of how our modern class structure works, and given that the media is so incredibly dominated by progressives, in a sense, from the media's perspective, Brett Kavanaugh's not one of them. He's not in their class. Carlos Maza is, and Joe Biden is. That's why Joe Biden gets this opinion piece in the New York Times with him in a beautiful portrayal. Like, can you imagine Brett Kavanaugh ever being portrayed so accurately and so? I mean, look at the picture they chose for Brett Kavanaugh here. Him looking angry and the idea that he's a privileged person, whereas Joe Biden is seen stoic and ready to lead, looking much younger than he really is, kind of very much doing a very good job of hiding all the Botox. It's really obvious that they're not treated the same way, and it's because they're members of a different class. And in the modern culture in 2020, conservatives are effectively peasants. And what that means in the context of privilege is that it's not just that it's okay to advocate for violence against conservatives, but not liberals. It also means that your comments are interpreted more charitably if you're a liberal, but not interpreted charitably at all if you're a conservative. Right? This is why liberals get away with saying all sorts of abhorrent things in their past. If they say they're better than that now, they're forgiven because they're a member of the class. Another thing is how accusations against you are treated. Right? It's not novel in society to say that accusations against aristocrats have to have more weight. They have to have more rigor, which is why you have this very lawyerly, detailed article and a reminder to the accuser. And so this also explains why the New York Times is doing this lawyerly and reporterly read on the Tara Reade situation and the Tara Reade allegation. It's because Joe Biden is a member of a privileged class, so you can't speculate about him. You can't go too far. You can't go beyond what the evidence says. So they're doing a very dry reporterly take. But Joe, on the other hand, Brett Kavanaugh is not this person, and they can add as much color as they want to. And if Christine Blasey Ford wants to talk about making an accusation, her motives aren't impeached. She's not told that if she lied about this, that she might face criminal prosecution. No, they write a puff personal piece about the accusers against Republicans and a very dry reporterly piece about the accusers of Democrats. That's how privilege functions, right? If you are a member of one class, accusations against you are treated skeptically. If you're a member of another class, accusations are treated as presumptively true. This is all the way back to Kill a Mockingbird, basically. And, what are we going to do about this, though? I hate when conservatives say, well, look at the double standard. They don't have anything to say about what we can actually do about it. I really do get tired of that. That's something I really want to avoid. And I wrote a piece called Against Peacetime Conservatism that should get to this. And this is an old piece. This is almost a year old now, but it's one of the favorite pieces I've written for Human Events. And I talk about that one of the things that you do as a peacetime conservative is that you never assume that your opponents are acting in good faith, right? You never, ever assume that. And the other thing I think that's important is that, a wartime conservative is not willing to hesitate to use government power to achieve conservative ends. We should see the media as an adversary. We should want to hurt it. We should want to do things to it that hurt it. Now, I think that shouldn't detract from our overall goal of preserving the Constitution and constitutional rights. Conservatives, I believe, want a lawful and orderly society, and part of that is respecting the Constitution. But within that framework, we should be willing to use government power to achieve conservative ends. And also, that means we don't necessarily take every Supreme Court case as gospel. Conservatives don't treat Roe versus Wade as gospel. We should be looking at other Supreme Court cases where maybe the court messed it up, and maybe we can be a little more aggressive. And I think one of them that is particularly relevant to the New York Times is a case called New York Times v. Sullivan. might not have caught this, but a little over a year ago, Justice Clarence Thomas, in an opinion concurring in the denial of certiorari, I believe, said that New York Times versus Sullivan should be reconsidered. Now, what is New York Times v. Sullivan? So what is New York Times v. Sullivan? Well, as Wikipedia explains, it was a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in which the court ruled that the freedom of speech protections in the First Amendment restrict the ability of American public officials to sue for defamation. And specifically, it held that a plaintiff in a defamation lawsuit, if they are a public official or running for public office, they have to prove what's called actual malice, meaning that the defendant either knew the statement was false or recklessly disregarded whether or not it was true. And that's a really hard thing to prove because people don't usually put knowledge of their own lying on paper. As long as they didn't do that, you're never going to find evidence of that, and so it's going to be extremely hard to prove. And this case basically had destroyed defamation law in this country, made it one of the hardest areas to be a plaintiff. Even if you are defamed by someone and they destroy your reputation, you didn't do anything. It's like you were completely innocent. They destroyed your reputation, and it's almost impossible to make them pay damages for it. That's odd, and it's out of step with almost every other Anglosphere country. And this is not the standard in England. It's not the standard in Australia. It's not the standard in Singapore. It's just the standard in the United States, and it's not even something that extends all the way back to the founding. It's really in 1964 that libel law was effectively eviscerated. And the point of Thomas is making, that he made in his concurring opinion, as you can see here, is that this is just not actually appropriate. The Constitution, as he says, the constitutional libel rules adopted by this court in New York Times broke sharply from the common law of libel, and there are sound reasons to question whether the First and 14th Amendments displaced this body of common law. And when these were ratified, you didn't actually have to prove heightened liability. Like, think about it. There was a First Amendment starting, right at the founding of the country, but yet at the time, you only needed to prove a false written publication that subjects someone to hatred, contempt, or ridicule. The idea being that the founders, and nobody at the time of the founding, would have understood the First Amendment to mean that you just had a free right to lie about people and destroy their reputations without paying damages. And the idea that that's somehow implicit in the First Amendment freedom of speech, I don't think that's right. There are other ways in which speech is restricted in this country, and you're not allowed to use speech to damage people. And for example, if you lie to someone and lead them to reasonably rely on your statements knowingly, and that causes them damage, that's fraud, right? But here, it's a different type of speech that is designed to destroy someone's reputation. And even if you're negligent about it, you have to prove that somebody intentionally and knowingly lied in order to get redress. That's just not the way I think it should work. And it's not necessarily constitutionally sound. Here's what would happen if you actually overturned a case like New York Times v. Sullivan. If you did, and suddenly it wasn't actual malice, but just negligence, what would a reasonable person do? And hold them liable if they are negligent in their misstatements. Well, then the way they're treating the Joe Biden allegation, right? Examining Tara Reade's sexual assault allegation, very neutral tone. That might be the way that the New York Times treats every sexual assault allegation. And they don't let people like, Mazie Hirono run wild, or they don't write bizarro world op-eds with Brett Kavanaugh fitting in the privileged kids and then have editor's notes like this. That they would be a lot more careful and a lot more fair. And that would do a lot to restore the trust of the media in this country. But moreover, it would hurt them. It would subject them to judgments. And at this point, I don't see a reason, I don't see the value of the New York Times continuing to be immune from liability for the damage that it routinely causes individuals in this country and for the damage it causes public discourse more generally. I don't think they deserve this immunity. I think the First Amendment and aggressive libel law that holds newspapers responsible for negligent defamation, I think that's can perfectly well coexist. And I don't see a reason why these people who treat conservatives with such contempt, who act in such an obviously biased way while pretending to be the paper of record, deserve any protection from this. So that's what should come out of this. When you think about the fact that the New York Times gave Brett Kavanaugh a completely unfair treatment and then treated Joe Biden with kid gloves, and you realize maybe we should do something about that. Maybe we as conservatives should be advocating government policies that put the screws to the New York Times. I think the first thing we can think about is making it a conservative legal goal to overturn New York Times v. Sullivan. In the same way that overturning Roe v. Wade is a conservative legal goal, I think overturning New York Times v. Sullivan should be seen as a primary conservative legal goal in the coming decade. That's what I got for you. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it interesting. If you did, again, youtube.com/humanevents. Well, don't unsubscribe. Hit the subscribe button. It really does help us, and it really helps us put out more content. Thanks so much. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you tomorrow.